Welcome to episode 6 of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. I'm your host, Todd Schaefer. My guest in this episode is Dr. Mark Coppenger, professor of philosophy and ethics at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he supervises a doctoral program on aesthetic theology. In our last episode, Dr. Coppenger and I talked about Christians and aesthetics, but in this episode, we're going to turn our attention to Christian film. But before we get to Dr. Coppenger, I'd like to bring something to your attention that really excites me. I've long admired the work of the Criterion Collection for bringing old films from all over the world into the mainstream market. And this month, April 2019, the Criterion Channel has been launched. For $10.99 per month, you can have access to over 1,000 old films, many of which are very hard to find elsewhere. C.S. Lewis urged us to read old books outside our own century because these old books don't have the blind spots that the books written in our generation does. I'd venture to say the same thing about film, and I think it's particularly important for Christian filmmakers to watch old films. As I said in the inaugural podcast, Christian filmmakers need to avoid the trap of following Hollywood convention. If we're going to revolutionize the Christian film genre, we need to do it not just by having a revolutionary message, we need to revolutionize our cinematic language. There's a great deal we can learn from Bergman, Fellini, Rene, Bresson, and so many other giants in the cinema. This is where we learn how to be filmmakers who write stories with images. And when you're ready to spend a few weekends with Kieslowski or Kurosawa, you'll find them at CriterionChannel.com. And I wasn't paid to say that. So now we go to my conversation with Dr. Coppenger. Next to the music industry, cinema and television is the most influential art form of our day, shaping our culture, shaping the way we view our world and ourselves. What place should Christians have in this cinematic art form?
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and I think of particular movies that just stunned me. One even way back in college was The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Had Alan Arkin in it, and it was about an unappreciated deaf man who cared for all these other people, and I don't know. I think on a scale of 1 to 10, my sensitivity to hurting people went from, who knows, from a 4 to a 7 or something. It was just quite amazing, and I could just go through so many films that blessed me or shocked me or instructed me. And what struck me is very strange. I was I guess you could say kind of a film buff, and when I went through my doctoral program at Vanderbilt, and I would go probably each week, and then I went to Wheaton to teach. And in the day, they were just 10 years away from saying that you couldn't go to movies if you were at Wheaton. And I had no idea because I'd gone all my life. I would see everything from Davy Crockett to Sound of Music to whatever to Ten Commandments. And so I would mention a film. I might be talking about Deer Hunter. That was in that day, or I don't know, MASH or something like the original, not the TV show. And some of the people were like, "Oh my goodness, we can't mention that. It's kind of a shock." The funny thing was, even before that, when I was coming out with my doctorate, I was in touch with King's College in Briarcliff Manor, New York. It's since moved to Manhattan. It was in the Empire State Building. Now it's down near Wall Street. And I was talking to the dean, and we were, making progress. And then I found out that you couldn't go to movies or to Broadway plays. And I thought, I'm just an hour up the Hudson from Sound of Music. What's that about? And so I just said, wow, I don't think this is going to work. So it astonished me that, and I understand there's just a lot of craziness and evil in the film industry, but it astonished me that they would absent themselves from that. Now, by the time I was at Wheaton, you could go to films, would be cautious, but still, it was just crazy to me. I thought, are you kidding me? This is like a nuclear device, and or a nuclear power plant, and you guys don't have anything to do with the electricity. It was very strange.
Yeah, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and my parents told me that when they were in their late teens, that the church forbid them from going to the cinema, along with dancing and drinking. the cinema was one of the evils of our age.
Right. Yeah. No, that was. I mean, the old joke about dancing was that you shouldn't be involved in premarital sex because it leads to dancing. I mean, it was just kind of. But anyway, there's a lot of variety in that, and of course, I mean, there are dangers and concerns all over the place. But to be, I mean, it's kind of like that H. Richard Niebuhr book, Christ and Culture. In many cases, there was a Christ against culture view, which is more associated with, well, extremely the Amish or something like that, where the world is wicked and you don't touch it with a stick. He has 5 ways that you relate. Sometimes it's the Christ of culture, Christ of culture and paradox, and so forth. And I partake of all of his approaches. I've never drunk alcohol. I mean, I was raised in a Baptist preacher's home, and it just wasn't part of my life. And all through the Army and grad school, I never needed it, but other Christians I've worked with do. So, but and I used to subscribe to HBO for a while, and then I just don't want to give them my money anymore because they do some terrible things, I think, or have. But I can appreciate when they run the Tuskegee Airmen thing, but in other cases it was trash. So sometimes I separate, sometimes I mix it up with, I don't want to judge people for their own personal choices, but to just say film is verboten, it just seems odd to me.
Yeah, it was a very short-sighted perspective, especially given the fact that it has such a tremendous reach and potential for influencing the world.
Incredible. And by the way, when I travel around the world, I'll see, and whether it's Jakarta or I guess Switzerland. I remember watching Schindler's List in Switzerland and seeing movies on billboards in all kinds of places around the world. The American film industry is a huge cultural force, not only here but all around the world.
Years ago, when I formed Glorious Films, I reached out to about 25 different theologians and people in the Christian world who I respected, who seemed to have some sort of interest in the arts based upon articles or books that they had written or things I had heard in conference messages. And I didn't want to do what I was doing alone. I was sort of in my bubble up here in Montreal, and I wanted to assemble an advisory board whom I could reach out to and bounce some ideas off of, show work in progress, get feedback, get really solid feedback from these influential people. And you were one of the first ones who responded to me with a yes. And since then, you have been one of my biggest champions and my most faithful counselor in this effort. And so my question to you is, as a very busy man who's got his fingers in so many different things, why did you say yes? What is it about Christian filmmaking that motivated you not only to be a part of my advisory board, but to lead it?
Well, I think part of it is just astonishment at the power of film and what can be done with it. And then when it's harnessed to represent the gospel or Christian understandings, I'm thrilled. And by the way, I mean, we've talked about this. Sometimes it's like, oh, that's so awkward and the like. But, maybe it's from working in a seminary. If somebody tries their first sermon and, it's 10 minutes long and it's, all of sin, wages of sin of death, and third point is every Baptist a tither, and the illustration is awkward and stuff. Instead of being appalled, that's like, well, that's a start. So I'm kind of encouraged when people are giving it a shot. I will say this, that sometimes you get great stuff done by non-evangelicals. I mean, I have to say I was, certainly blessed by Chariots of Fire and Trip to Bountiful, and there are a few others. And even, it's funny, we had some really pro-abortion movies like Vera Drake and Cider House Rules. But then right after that, you had Juno and Bella, and there's the Catholics they're making some good stuff too. Mel Gibson has done some stuff. Of course, you have as well. But it is funny how you get to. It doesn't have to come from the Billy Graham Association to thrill you. It can be almost a mistake by somebody outside. I saw one with Kiefer Sutherland where he was in a Japanese prison camp, and it had a redemptive theme in it too. By the way, when I first started seeing Christian films, I mean, two kinds. One one was like the Cecil B. DeMille thing, or the Robe or the Ten Commandments. But the other was with, I think it was called Worldwide Pictures, the Billy Graham
Yeah.
movies, and we'd go to theaters and fill them, and actually there'd be an evangelistic appeal, and that was okay too. It's like, yeah, those are our guys. I'm pulling for them, even though they weren't as captivating as Jaws or something like that.
Why do you think the church hasn't embraced the cinema in the last century?
There's an interesting one of the aesthetic uh, articles we read, or aesthetics book, talks about something called scopophilia. That is, the kind of the love of checking something out from a distance, and a lot of what you see in movies is like unholy. It seems like, I mean, some things are really pretty gruesome. I mean, I remember way back with a movie like The Wild Bunch or Bonnie and Clyde, with people, the exploding blood packets, and they're reeling, they're kind of writhing around as they're dead, or other people are fed into feeder chippers. I think at the end of Fargo,
Yeah, yeah.
there's a case like that, and you're gazing at it in a sense. You're kind of savoring it, and if you did that in real life, it'd be kind of creepy. Or if there's some like really attractive woman, and uh, and you're sitting in a restaurant looking at her and just gazing at her for minutes, uh, then that would be that would be creepy, and you'd have to question your spiritual health. And so, but in the movie, you have license to do that, and you actually do that, and it's kind of it can be voyeuristic in unholy ways. I mean, there are concerns about that, and I even think some people would say, I love film, but actually they just love the kind of tawdry things they can get out of film. So I mean, there are real dangers to this sort of thing, but you can impose your own sensitivities on other people, and they'll say, well, I could never watch Schindler's List because there was a bit of this or that in it, and you think, well, um, I'm not so easily stymied by that. I don't dwell on that. Rather, I learned a lot about helping someone in the Holocaust, and it's not always pleasant. I mean, sometimes you're calling. I remember for Kairos, I got the job to review Brokeback Mountain, and I didn't want to see it. Uh, so I bought the cheapest ticket in the afternoon. I didn't go in wearing glasses with a fake nose. Such a cartoon. It was so cheesy. I mean, you're kind of exulting up in the highlands, and it's so beautiful, the snow-capped peaks and the rushing mountain streams and the gay love of the highlands, and then they come back to conventionality and faithfulness in marriage and in hard work to support the family. And I think they put some kind of a dusky filter on it, so it's sort of like, oh, we're down here in the fever swamps of or the drudgery of life, and it just seems so cheesy. It's so preachy and so phony. So I didn't appreciate the film, but I thought it was good to write about it, and so I endured it. So I mean, people have different reasons. I mean, you need, sometimes you need to see, and other times you're just looking for one aspect, like how in the world does whatever, how does Spielberg pull it off, or how does Fellini pull it off, that kind of thing.
Well, looking at it from a mission standpoint, it would seem that the church would have embraced this a long time ago to help us fulfill the Great Commission. And some do, but in the big scheme of things, it only seems to have happened in very meager measure.
Yeah, and I mean, here are a couple of things that come to mind. One, I read this article with regard to it was about newscasters and sportscasters, and how the big voices on the air are typically Jewish or Catholic. And so, with regard to news, you'll have Hannity, Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly or Chris Matthews, and it goes on and on and on down the line. The Jewish, Bill Kristol, Michael Medved, Mark Levin, and the like. And you don't have that many evangelicals. And I think that our tradition is more, is not to, I don't know what it is, engage the culture. I mean, except maybe in some politics like against abortion, but to really get into the culture And so we just sort of absented the field, and we don't quite know how to do it, and we don't have like our own whatever Spielberg or Orson Welles or whatever. Um, I mean, here's one problem. I mean, there are a couple of problems. One is, I really do think it's expensive. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts, and to get at the level of like Industrial Light and Magic, or if you Disney Studios, or what have you, that takes a lot of money, and to assemble a lot of people to bring this off and then do it, and then it gets played in limited theaters, and it's kind of shuttled aside. We saw Gosnell the other night, and it was a pretty extraordinary film, but it was a special play, and a lot of people are shunning that movie. So you go to all this expense, and it's pretty much kind of preaching to the choir. I mean, a huge problem is that the culture doesn't like what we have. I mean, they rejected Christ. I
Yeah.
mean, they have abused people who are bringing a clear Christian message all through the ages. So, when you don't have a big audience, when they don't flock to it the way they might flock to another feature, you just think, well, duh. I mean, we're aliens in this world. So I don't know. Maybe sometimes you're thinking, wow, we could put a lot into this, and they'll still say, go play with it in the street. I don't know. I just think our culture is so gone. I mean, I think you mentioned once about these a variety of people like the Rembrandts and the I mean, so many people, Dürer, but that was in Christendom.
Yeah.
In other words, there was a big crowd of people, of patrons and consumers of these things, and I think more and more we're post-Christian. People just think anything that's godly and Christ-like stinks. I mean, that's a tough thing.
That was also in the time of the Catholic Church's heyday when it was very wealthy and spending gobs of money on art.
Absolutely, yeah.
Something we've seen in the last decade or so, with the success of films like Fireproof, the Kendrick Brothers films, I Can Only Imagine, is that there is a huge Christian market that is hungry for this stuff. I mean, our market is underserved by Hollywood, but the difficulty lies in connecting the filmmaker with the audience.
Yeah. I mean, as I say, we're new to this. I think evangelicals are maybe a little bit more pietistic, and so we don't automatically think in terms of a big cultural splash. I think of that Kendrick movie, Facing the Giants. So it's really interesting in that they were using a piece of music that Sony controlled, and so they contacted Sony and they said, "Well, let's see the film. What are you doing there?" And they took it up and they released it under Samuel Goldwyn Pictures, and it made a big profit. I mean, they didn't spend that much on it. I forget, it's in tens of thousands of dollars, and they made a lot more on it. And I think, and in other cases, like some of these big corporations are discovering that a Christian book label would be good. So HarperCollins might pick up Zondervan or something like this. So I think maybe some of these guys are starting to understand that there is a big market out there. Um, so I'm hopeful that that'll be a trend. I will say this: I do think it's interesting to see how the industry is becoming more decentralized. It used to be that if it weren't whatever RKO or MGM or you name it making the films, or even Miramax or something like that, then you were kind of stuck. But more and more, because of these technologies that are cheaper and they're savvy all over the place, I think you can have a lot of small independent films, and you don't have to be controlled by these guys. And there's a shorts channel, and people can make shorts, and so I'm hopeful that bubbling up, and of course you're a major player in this, and with your skill set, that more and more people will say that is where I want to invest my life, and you don't have to go and kowtow to MGM for money.
Yeah, it's hard. I can tell you that. I'm sitting on a film right now that's 80% done, and we're struggling to find completion funds for it. We just haven't found the investors who are interested in financing a Christian film.
By the way, Gosnell, I think they did crowdsourcing or something like that, and they raised a bunch of money and did a good job with it. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, it does, and from a lot of different realms. We just we tend to think about movies having writers and directors and actors and cameramen and soundmen, but there's a whole army of people behind every film. All you have to do is sit at the end of a film and watch the credit roll. And that's just the production aspect, and then there's the whole distribution and marketing aspect that needs to be resourced with knowledgeable, skilled people. And then all those pieces have to work together, or your film's going nowhere.
Well, they're expensive. I mean, if some artist wants to take up some paints and stretch a canvas and have at it, he can do that in a couple of days and bring it to the church, and they might say, "We want that on the wall," and pay him $100 to $1,000, and it's done. Whereas with filmmaking, whether it's animation or documentary or whatever, it takes a bunch of folks.
Yeah, and there's so much content being produced today. And then you have Netflix, which is outproducing all of the Hollywood studios combined in terms of number of productions happening in episodic series and film. But Christian films are not keeping in step with the volume of stuff produced. So the percentage of Christian content is dropping.
Partially too, if I have $1 million and I can give it, and have my name on the scoreboard at Rice University or the Arts Center at Vanderbilt or something like that, and they'll see it for generations. Why would I give my $1 million to a guy who says, "Look, this might work, and we might get some distribution, and it's the life of Roger Williams, and we're pretty excited about that." And I say, "Yeah." So it plays for 3 weeks, and then what goes to cable? I mean, it's so important for people to realize how incredibly impactful these things can be. I've wondered. We get Netflix and Amazon Prime and some other things, and it strikes me, for one thing, how dark this stuff is, and it just tells me our nation's heart is dark. I mean, the Kevin Spacey, the one in D.C. in politics, and you've got another really dark one with Bill Macy in it, and then you have, I think, something called American Gods, and that looks very strange and dark, and it just seems like one thing after another. There was one where a guy retreats to the Ozarks. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the names right now.
Ozark.
Yeah, it's Ozark. That's right. But I'm just thinking, when you get to know these people, it's just so dark and dysfunctional, and that seems to be, I don't think these guys are economically insane, like, oh, if we make that, we'll turn people off and never watch it. People are going to it like hogs to slop, and it's being made, but I just wonder if the people have any appetite for something uplifting. Again, we are an audience. I guess I'm thinking evangelism now and outreach, but we're an audience, and so we're happy. I saw one called The Apostle Paul recently, which I thought was very good. Jim Caviezel was in it, and I really liked that. But I thought, I'm not sure that the world at large, even if we make it super good, would want it. The tastes are so degraded now.
But nowadays, the streaming services are not really abiding by any kind of meaningful rating system. Although I did read recently that Netflix is going to be following the Motion Picture Association of America's rating system. But the other thing is that people just don't care about the ratings anymore. And in fact, the more mature a rating is on a program, the more desirable it is. I think that there is a large section of the unbelieving audience that does want quality, wholesome, uplifting films that aren't always dragging in the gutter. When I talk to my non-Christian friends, I've been surprised to find how many of them have very high standards, in fact, higher than some Christians I know, for the kinds of entertainment they watch.
Yeah, I was in the Pentagon. I'm an old ROTC product from 1970 and did 28 years, and the Guard and Reserve. And so some of my last assignments were at the Army Office of Public Affairs. And one of my assignments was to coordinate with the Army for the premieres of Clear and Present Danger at the Kennedy Center. And there was one with Pauly Shore called In the Army Now. And wasn't much good, but it was made at Fort Sill. And so they had a special showing at the MPAA headquarters. I think it was Jack Valeni was head of it then. And I met him in his office and we talked a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of a marginal thing, but I've been in their offices and seen their work. Incidentally, there's a guy when I was there in the Pentagon named Phil Straub whose job was to coordinate with television and movie people to see they would request gear like in the right stuff or something, or not the right stuff. The one with Val Kilmer and Tom Cruise about flights off a carrier. I'm drawing a blank right now.
Top Gun.
Top Gun and Miramar out there to get the use of an aircraft carrier. Then you have to clear it with the Pentagon, and if they say no, then you end up kind of having to simulate, or if you're going to use real Humvees or whatever. But that is a big, big deal that the Pentagon is concerned about. Is how we play in the movies. They know they're important. For sure. But you're right. I think one big reason, I think it's sad, but one big reason people get HBO and Cinemax and so forth is that way they can, in the privacy of their home, see naughty things, and and they sure serve it up. One thing though about it's sort of like preaching or missions. You don't say, oh, well, if they don't have an appetite, I'm not going to do it. No, you preach. You preach the word. You do our stuff. I mean, that's our calling, and you do it the best you can. And, so what if most people don't pick up on it? And now they might. Yeah. I mean, what? Chariots of Fire won an Academy Award. I think they won Best Picture.
Yeah, it did.
By the way, one thing that encourages me, I think that we have areas where we can do some work, but as I think about going to the movie now, I look. Sometime I'll have a night off when I'm at Louisville, and I'll check. And it really does seem, and I'm not gainsaying this genre, but it's just one Marvel comic superhero. So and so meets Trident, and then they're spider webs off of buildings, and Thor's cutting here, and it seems like it's all pitched to younger people. I think that adults are starved for really thoughtful stuff and uplifting stuff.
That's a good point.
And by the way, we've got so many great stories to tell. I was just reading a little bio of Adoniram Judson tonight, and just how he was led away from the faith at Brown University, and then later on in life, somebody was dying in a room next to him, and it sounded horrible, and it turned out to be the atheist who had led him away from the church, and he ends up in Burma, and it's just, incredible stories. And they will take, in the other filmmakers will take some little thing or an interesting character. I mean, even like Butch Cassidy or Serpico or whatever, or billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri or something, and turn it into a great story. And I know we turn them into hagiographies, and we make them so precious and that they don't have verisimilitude anymore. But if we could tell the story with the grain and the grit and the granularity and the honesty, we have so many unbelievable stories to tell. I mean, Cartwright, a circuit rider, and they said that nobody out, the weather's so bad today, nobody's out but crows and Methodist preachers, and he was a rough old dude. And, you turn that over to somebody who's really got a craft and a budget, and that's a yarn.
Well, many Christians like to assert that we have the greatest stories to tell because we can put all the pieces of the puzzle of humanity, of God's kingdom, of this world together, and that our stories have eternal, transcendent value. And I think that's true. But then there's been a lot of books written recently by Christians analyzing Hollywood films and trying to find all of these Christian themes that are embedded in this. And they even support it by the fact that even an unbeliever has the imprint of God upon them, and somehow that these grand themes are woven in the heart of man. But my response is, I think that these things are very superficial. They're not very specific enough to be of value to anyone unless there's a Christian there to unpack it for them and show it to them. And then my question is, well, why don't you unpack Scripture? Because Scripture's much more powerful than some movie that never had any intention to communicate what the Christian is trying to pull out of it.
The truth.
Like, don't murder. Well, we're for that. It's not specifically Christian. I don't know if I sent you a copy. I used to edit SBC Life magazine, and I went out to L.A. and interviewed some people who were in the industry, and they reflected upon their work there. And one of the guys, it was a guy who actually made. It was called The Pistol, and I saw it on a Delta airline plane first, but it was about Pete Maravich and his youth and the like, and he became a strong Christian. But this guy was saying, we're like servants in Caesar's palace. You find in the New Testament that all through the thing. And he said one guy was doing scripts for Home Improvement, and another was a production assistant for The Sandlot, the one about, and I think they filmed it in Salt Lake City, but the ball gets over the fence and they have this scary dog and that sort of deal. And they're all through that. Jess Moody, when he was out there in Van Nuys, would have all kinds of people in his church. Some of them you just like, oh no, how you can't look to see how it's going to turn out with Burt Reynolds and Lonnie Anderson, or I think one of the Quaids was in there, and they had a guy named Al Kasha who won an Oscar for doing the music for either the Poseidon Adventure or Towering Inferno. So they're out there, but they don't have big influence. But there's a little bit of antiseptic value that they have in some cases, where they could say, yeah, I don't think so. Look, on Kairos Journal, one of the publishers, Mrs. Campuris, was in Sesame Street for a dozen years or so, and she created a bunch of characters, including Meryl Sheep. Meryl Sheep, she co-hosted the Today Show with the Count, and every once in a while, Henson would say, "Hey, let's do this. Let's kind of make something cute about witches," and she'd say, I don't feel good about that. I mean, this was Anton LaVey's season, and the Count is Dracula, and why don't you make somebody his wife? And she said, I don't feel good about that, to sort of make light of the occult. And Henson would back off, and he'd say, well, we'll do something else. We'll change this little jingle. And so, yeah, God bless them, but I think it's a long way for devout Orthodox Christians to be studio chiefs, but I think it's a both and thing. Christian filmmakers, and then we need people who are throughout the industry. And I do think the industry's having a tough time. I mean, I know Amazon, Netflix, these guys are going great guns, and it kind of hurts my feeling to go to the theater and there were like 8 people in there, and so I try to buy a bunch of popcorn and Coke just to keep the thing afloat. I think they're in a teachable moment now.
Well, the whole industry right now is in a very confused state, and everybody's very insecure about it because the streaming services have established themselves, and there's this big power play, and nobody knows how anything is going to fall out, whether they're going to be able to make money and it used to be that you could pre-sell your film to different territories before you made the film. In order to finance it, but you just can't find anybody who's going to do that today, or if there are some, they're very, very hard to find.
Did not know. Not surprised.
Yeah.
Not surprised. But it's not going away. I mean, it's it's going to be powerful right down the line. Incidentally, we enjoy watching BBC stuff. We just watched 4 of it's like Mr. Whicher's Suspicions or something like that, and it's a detective in Britain or what have you. What was it, Summerby Murders or something like that. Sometimes we watch these murder mysteries, and it seems as though almost every time when there is early on someone in the episode who has a Bible and quotes verses, or has a cross on the wall,
Huh.
or they're either going to be the murderer or some kind of creep. It's just so predictable. You'll have some twit as an Anglican priest or some phony or judgmental guy, and you think, come on, BBC, give us a break. So, boy, if some of these could just do a sympathetic treatment of a minister, and we've done the same thing. I mean, you'll have a guy preach hellfire and brimstone out in the Wild West, and then in the night he'll slip around behind the wagon and take a nip and try to grab some gal or something like that. And you say, yeah, come on, give us a break.
I'll continue my conversation with Dr. Coppenger in our next episode. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. You will find the Ministry of Motion Pictures on the web and the show notes for this episode at ministryofmotionpictures.org. And don't forget to check out the Criterion channel at criterionchannel.com.